Hello, and welcome to Beyond Books, where we talk about books and beyond. I'm your host, I'm Renee, and today I'm going to do something a little bit different. Last year, around this time, I made a video in this very same room, in this sunroom, about this book called A Very Virginia Christmas. It was compiled and edited by Wilford Kale. It has stories from different people, and they're basically all about Christmas. Not all are about Virginia, but some are very specific to the Virginia area. Last year, like I say, I read some stories out of it and talked a little bit about it. And I was going to redo the video this year. But I went back and looked at it, and it was really not that bad at all. Once you can get past the beginning part where I was obviously a little bit nervous, I had only been on BookTube for maybe a month or so at the time that I made it. It's really not a bad video at all. And I did talk about the stories in the book that were interesting to me. So I think I'm just going to do this new introduction and then put the rest of the video together using the one from last year and just send it out there into the YouTube universe again and see what happens. I didn't leave it up very long last time, so I'll bet most of you have not seen this video. So enjoy. A Very Virginia Christmas. Virginia is the state that I live in, and I just wanted to learn a little bit more about the traditions of the area. I haven't lived here for very long. I thought that I was only going to read maybe a few stories out of the book. Well, yesterday was a rainy day, and I ended up reading the book from cover to cover, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So there were a few stories that I wanted to talk about here on my channel. And let's get started with the first one. So might as well start where it all began. And that's with George Washington. This is him crossing the Delaware. And this story is by Jeff Westover. And it talks about how George Washington was the first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, but that it could also be said that he was the first in Christmas. One of the things that is commented here is that the native Virginian, meaning Mr. Washington, was renowned both before and after the Revolutionary War for his annual Christmas festivities at Mount Vernon, featuring what is touted as his own unique recipe for holiday grog, possibly the first real American eggnog. To this day, this recipe is noted for its kick. So, further on in the book, on page 105, in fact, there is a story specifically about eggnog. It is by Martin Kohler. And it gives us Washington's eggnog recipe. So, are you ready for this? This has been modified for today's use. And it calls for 1 pint of brandy, half a pint of rye whiskey, a 1/4 pint of Jamaican rum, 1/4 pint of sherry, 30 eggs, 12 tablespoons of sugar, 1 quart of milk, and 1 quart of whipping cream whipped. And the directions are that the liquor should be mixed first. Then you are to separate the eggs, beat the yolks, add sugar, mix well, add the liquor slowly, beating constantly. Add milk, then whipped cream while slowly beating. Beat the egg whites until stiff, and slowly fold them into the mixture. Allow to stand in a cool place for several days. Taste frequently, the recipe concluded. So that recipe will serve 50. So if any of you decide to make that recipe and serve it, please let me know in the comments below how that turned out. It sounds like it should be pretty interesting. Some other stories in the book, besides things that are of a more historical nature, there were things that, for me, brought back memories from Christmases when I was a child. One was this story, A Christmas in the 1960s. That would have been when I was a small school-age child. And this story is by Beth Trissel. It talks about her first Christmas in the United States. Her family had been overseas previously, so she didn't know a lot about Christmas traditions. She was about 6 years old when they came here to Virginia to live with some relatives in the Shenandoah Valley. And so there was a couple of paragraphs here that really resonated with me that I'd like to read. The day before Christmas finally came. The old brick house was filled with tantalizing smells. The kitchen door opened periodically, the sleigh bells on it announcing the arrival of yet more friends, bringing yet more gifts. Friends, neighbors, family, all exchanged gifts, even if it was only a plate of cookies exchanged for yours. Presents were stashed in every corner of the front room, covering the old piano and stacked beneath, wrapped in paper and ribbons, which I found almost too beautiful to bear. I knew there were some for me among them, that I was not in total reliance on Santa. Even so, I longed to be kindly remembered by him. As any child can attest, Christmas Eve is the longest day of the year, and one in which we make extreme nuisances of ourselves, asking endless questions and climbing over and under the furniture to see which gifts were ours. So that was a good little story that, just like I say, I didn't grow up in Virginia, but it did bring back some memories for me with the 60s and people visiting, people bringing gifts that were often homemade or bringing over baked goods and things like that, especially neighbors and other family members that maybe you hadn't seen for a while. So yeah, I enjoyed that. So the next story I'd like to talk about has a very famous title, although it's not really a story about the state of Virginia. It is a story about a girl named Virginia, and that story is, Yes, Virginia, There is a Santa Claus. I know that this has been made into I believe a cartoon or possibly even into a movie, I'm not sure, but this story here is written by Frances Church, and it talks about this little girl in the late 1800s. Her name was Virginia O'Hanlon, and she asked her dad one day, like I'm sure we all did at one point, if there really was a Santa Claus. And he replied that if you see it in the newspaper, then it must be so. Probably not something we'd say to a child these days. But anyway, Virginia was moved to go ahead and write a letter to the editor of the paper to ask if there really was a Santa Claus. And an editor by the name of Frances Church, so this must be a relative, published Virginia's letter, actually on the first page of the newspaper, and he also gave her what is now a very famous reply, where he tells her the famous line, "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. He exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist, and you know that they abound and give to your life its highest beauty and joy. How dreary would the world be if there were no Santa Claus?" And he goes on to say to her that you don't always see Santa Claus, but it doesn't mean that he isn't there. That there are other things to believe in, and that sometimes they come out in the joy of being human. When we read poetry and when we read books, when we look at art. So I really like that story as well, and I thought that that was a good one. I don't think ever read the original story, even though I kind of knew about it. So the final section of the book talks about Christmas carols. And do you recall the most famous reindeer of all? Of course, that's Rudolph. It talks about this Christmas carol. This is a little story about it by Leslie Melville. And it talks about the man who actually wrote the Rudolph story. His name is Robert May. And this was in the early 1900s. He was kind of down on his luck. His wife was very ill, and he had no actual gifts that he was able to give to his little daughter. But he had been making up a story about a reindeer who gets made fun of. But then one foggy Christmas Eve, we all know the story. But what he ended up doing was he wrote it in a book. He made a little book, and he was going to give it to his daughter on Christmas. But just a few days prior to that, there was the Christmas office party at his office where he worked. And so he read the story there. And some important people captured their attention, captured their imagination. And long story short, it ended up getting published. It was famously recorded later in the 60s into a song by Gene Autry. Several famous people actually were approached about doing the song but refused to because they felt like the song was too juvenile. So that's interesting because it went on to become one of the most famous Christmas carols that there are. And then also another Christmas carol that's very popular, Jingle Bells. That one has a certain distinction. It is the first song that was ever played in space. In 1965, December of 1965, there were 2 astronauts in space on the Gemini 6 mission. And they sent this report to Mission Control in Houston, Texas. They said, "We have an object. Looks like a satellite going from north to south. Probably in polar orbit. Looks like it might be going to re-enter soon. You just might let me pick up that thing. I see a command module and 8 smaller modules in front. The pilot of the command module is wearing a red suit. The astronauts had smuggled a tiny harmonica and sleigh bells into the spacecraft and proceeded with their version of Jingle Bells." So I enjoyed this book. I hope that you enjoyed my readings from it, and I sincerely hope that you will find a way to make the season special for you. So thank you very much for watching. Remember that you are the author of your own story. Make it a good one, and have a great day.